October 18, 1909. The first frost settled over Briar Ridge before dawn, silvering the fence posts and glazing the narrow road that cut through the valley. By mid-morning, the church bell began to ring without pause. It was not Sunday. It was not a holiday. And before the sun reached its highest point, every soul in that isolated Appalachian hollow knew something had happened at the Whitaker estate. What they did not yet know was how deeply that morning would fracture the silence that had protected one family for nearly half a century. Briar Ridge was never marked clearly on most maps. It existed in the folds of the mountains, where timber pressed close and coal seams ran deep beneath the soil. In the late 19th century, it was a place defined by distance. Rail lines passed miles away, telegraph wires stopped short of the valley, news traveled by horse, by rumor, or by the echo of gunfire across the hills. The land was fertile in parts and stubborn in others. Winters were unforgiving. Summers were heavy and wet, and for decades, one family's name carried more weight than the mountain itself. The Whitakers arrived shortly after the Civil War, purchasing large tracts of land when many others could not afford to hold on to theirs. Ezra Whitaker, the patriarch, was a quiet but calculating man. He bought timber rights before timber was in high demand. He leased coal seams to outside investors. He extended loans to struggling farmers, collecting interest in land when payments failed. By the 1880s, nearly every road, mill, and store in Briar Ridge bore some trace of Whitaker ownership. The family did not flaunt its wealth. It enforced it quietly. Ezra's son, Jonathan Whitaker, inherited not only the land, but the authority that came with it. He was educated in Richmond, returned with tailored suits and northern ideas, and built the largest home the valley had ever seen, a 3-story structure of dark wood and stone overlooking the ridge. From its porch, one could see nearly every field and cabin below. Some called it a symbol of progress. Others called it a watchtower. Under Jonathan's control, the Whitaker holdings expanded. The sawmill doubled production. Coal extraction intensified. Sharecroppers signed contracts few could read. Wages were often paid in company scrip redeemable only at the Whitaker General Store. Outwardly, it was an efficient system. Privately, resentment took root. Yet dissent rarely rose above a whisper. The Whitakers employed most of the valley's men. They financed the church roof and the schoolhouse repairs. They paid for funerals. And when necessary, they reminded families of debts. By the turn of the century, Jonathan Whitaker was the unchallenged authority in Briar Ridge. His wife, Eleanor, hosted gatherings that reinforced alliances. His younger brother Thomas managed the books and the mines, and his only son Samuel grew up within the boundaries of expectation. Samuel was different from his father. Where Jonathan was rigid, Samuel was restless. He rode beyond the family's property lines. He spoke openly with laborers. He questioned contracts. Those conversations did not go unnoticed. Strange tensions began to surface in 1907 when a miner named Caleb Dunn was found injured near the eastern shaft. Officially, it was described as a cave caused by unstable rock. Unofficially, there were murmurs of ignored safety warnings. Caleb survived for 3 days, long enough to speak to his wife, but not long enough to make a public accusation. The Whitakers covered the funeral costs. The mine reopened within a week. Then there was the matter of the petition. In early 1909, several families quietly drafted a letter requesting wage adjustments and safer conditions. It was never delivered. Somehow, Jonathan Whitaker knew of its existence before the ink had fully dried. The men involved were called individually to the estate. None would later describe those meetings in detail. Within a month, 2 of the petitioners had left the valley entirely. And so when October 18 arrived, the atmosphere in Briar Ridge was already strained. That morning, a stable hand named Isaac Turner approached the Whitaker estate to deliver feed. He noticed first that the front door stood open. That was unusual. The Whitakers valued order. He stepped onto the porch and called out. There was no answer. The silence felt unnatural, as if the house itself were holding its breath. Inside the study, Jonathan Whitaker was found seated behind his desk. A revolver lay on the floor. A single gunshot wound marked his chest. The window behind him was closed. There were no signs of forced entry, no struggle, no broken glass. The official statement would later describe it as self-inflicted, but those who knew Jonathan Whitaker struggled to accept that explanation. Eleanor Whitaker claimed she had been visiting a neighbor that morning. Samuel insisted he had been riding along the western boundary. Thomas Whitaker arrived shortly after the bell began to ring. He took control of the scene before the county sheriff could reach the valley. The revolver was collected. The body was prepared quickly. By nightfall, whispers had replaced facts. The sheriff's investigation was brief and inconclusive. Distance worked in the Whitakers' favor. Evidence was minimal. Testimonies were carefully aligned. The revolver belonged to Jonathan. Powder burns were consistent with close range, yet there were inconsistencies few dared to voice. The angle of the wound did not align neatly with Jonathan's dominant hand. The chair behind his desk had been moved slightly off-center, and several ledger books were missing from the shelves. Within a week, Thomas Whitaker assumed operational control of the estate. Samuel retreated from public view. Eleanor ceased her gatherings. The mines continued to operate. Timber shipments did not slow. To the outside world, little had changed. But in Briar Ridge, a subtle shift could be felt. Fear had replaced resentment. Rumors multiplied in the absence of clarity. Some believed Jonathan had discovered financial discrepancies. Others suggested he had planned to alter labor agreements, angering powerful partners beyond the valley. A few whispered that Samuel's growing dissent had led to confrontation. None of these theories were proven. None were formally investigated. Months later, a fire destroyed one of the smaller storage barns on Whitaker property. Officially, it was deemed accidental. Unofficially, some claimed it contained older contracts and correspondence. Around the same time, Samuel Whitaker left Briar Ridge altogether. He relocated to Louisville and rarely returned. Thomas remained, managing the estate with colder precision than his brother ever had. Over the following decade, Briar Ridge declined. Coal veins thinned. Timber stands were exhausted. Families moved away in search of steadier work. The Whitaker estate remained imposing, but its dominance no longer felt absolute. By 1922, Thomas Whitaker sold significant portions of the land to outside companies. He died quietly 3 years later. Eleanor Whitaker lived long enough to see the estate fall into disrepair. She never spoke publicly about the morning of October 18. When she passed in 1931, many believed whatever truths she held were buried with her. Today, the foundation of the Whitaker house still overlooks Briar Ridge. Weathered stones mark where walls once stood. Locals speak of ledgers never found, of debts erased without explanation, of a gunshot that echoed longer than a single morning. The official record lists Jonathan Whitaker's death as a suicide. It remains the only explanation ever formalized. But questions endure. Why were key documents missing? Why did the investigation end so abruptly? Why did Samuel leave so suddenly? And why did Thomas consolidate power so swiftly? In isolated places like Briar Ridge, truth can be shaped as easily as timber and buried as deeply as coal. Perhaps Jonathan Whitaker was a man overwhelmed by pressures unseen. Perhaps he uncovered something that threatened not only his authority, but the fragile economy of the valley. Or perhaps the answer lies in a convergence of ambition, fear, and silence that defined the era itself. What remains undeniable is this: one family ruled Briar Ridge for nearly half a century, and the day that rule fractured, clarity vanished with it. The mountains still hold their shadows. The valley still carries its stories. And somewhere between record and rumor, the true account of October 18, 1909, waits to be understood. What do you believe happened inside the Whitaker study that morning? And why did no one press harder for the truth?